Good morning, afternoon, and evening to everyone. And I want to welcome you to webinar session 8 about technology-enabled mobility and where are we going with this topic. And I'm sure we only have a certain amount of time to speak about it, but it's a topic that's near and dear to a lot of our hearts and requires a lot of discussion right now, given our whole transportation ecosystem, and particularly talking about on-demand transportation. We have a great panel today, and not only do I look forward to everyone's presentation, but I also look forward to the discussion session after this. So at this point, I just want to very briefly talk about what we'll cover in the session. 3 major points. One, what is it that we need in on-demand transportation to keep our cities moving? What's the future of on-demand transportation? It looks much different than it used to many years ago when we really didn't have a lot of on-demand options. So that's one point. Another point, very, very important in the on-demand world, is talking about data sharing. And really, what is it that we need to look at there? Is it open data? What surrounds this whole idea about data sharing, and what is necessary to make those on-demand platforms work properly for the customer? And then finally, it's integrating new mobility services into an existing network. And we always talk about it as if there really isn't a lot involved in it, but frankly, it can be very complicated. And when we begin to talk about things like mobility as a service, which will be discussed tomorrow in a webinar session, I think it's important for us to talk about that integration piece. So with that brief introduction, I want to move right into our great presentations for this morning. And we'll start with Marcel Porras, who's the Chief Sustainability Officer at the Los Angeles Department of Transport. So I'll hand it over to you, Marcel.
Thanks, Carol. And good morning, everyone. It is 6:45 a.m. here in Los Angeles. The Lakers are going to become soon the next world champions of the NBA, and the Dodgers lost yesterday, but we're still in the playoffs, and we're looking good. So let me just jump right into it. As Carl said, I'm the Chief Sustainability Officer for LADOT. I've been in this role for the last 5 years. Previous to that, I was Associate Director for Mayor Garcetti in his administration. And prior to that, I worked for the City Council with various roles from transportation to planning and economic development. And so I've really been able to be here in Los Angeles to experience, I think, kind of full circle, the transportation disruption cycles to, when I started here in the office, I think the most innovative thing, the first innovative thing that we did was pilot bicycle sharrows, which don't really seem that innovative now, but I think it's just a testament to how far we've come here in the city, prioritizing mobility and accessibility, but we still have an incredible amount to go. My presentation today is going to just highlight a couple of the things that we're doing around shared mobility, and looking forward to the Q&A to proceed it and to hear from my fellow colleagues as well. So in Los Angeles, I think it's important to remember that the car is still king, and it really kind of plays itself out in terms of you know, what is made available to you. In LA right now, you can reach 12 times as many jobs in an hour by car as you can by transit. And, you know, understanding that a person in a car takes up 9 times as much space as a person on a train or a bus. You know, 80% of all trips in Los Angeles pre-COVID were by car. And when you look at just commute trips, that number increases to 90%. When we think about Los Angeles in the last 12 years, we've taken on 2 additional half-cent sales taxes to fund public transportation, and currently have one of the largest transportation infrastructure programs in the country, building a combination of rail lines, light rail, heavy rail, and bus lanes. I think one of the things here in Los Angeles is, although a big piece of the infrastructure is around rail building, around 75 to 80% of all transit trips are still made up by bus trips, with a large percentage, the overwhelmingly majority of the percentage of users being low income, very low income, with an average household income of $20,000. But for us here in the city of LA, we understand that that investment is ongoing, but I think it is, we understand that even when that infrastructure is built out, there's still going to be a need for Angelenos to augment or to have more mobility choices. And so I think in the last several years, we've been really focusing on expanding our shared mobility options, you know, outside of just walking and biking. And I think one of the things that previously that the city had done was allow for car sharing to exist. And so car sharing here in Los Angeles has existed, and it's taken the form of private operators such as Zipcar, FlexCar, Maven. You know, there was a lot of interest at one point from Car2Go, Motion, which is a spinoff of Hyundai, that's currently operating in Los Angeles. But I think one of the things that the city of Los Angeles decided to do a few years ago was really invest and kind of act as like an activist investor in promoting not just car share, not just electric car share, but electric car sharing for low-income communities, understanding that low-income communities were those most in need for automobile access. And so we currently have the largest EV car sharing program targeting disadvantaged communities in the country. I think news to that is that, as many of you know, that service was operated by Bolloré, the French company who famously launched Autolib in Paris and operated several car sharing operations globally. They have recently exited the market, and we have a new owner here locally in Los Angeles for Blue LA. And that is a company by the name of Blink, based out of Miami, which is traditionally focused on EV charging. The footprint of our program here in Los Angeles includes 100 cars and 200 chargers, spaced out around 40 locations. You know, when we look at total trips generated from that system, 61% of those trips are being generated by low-income qualifying households. And prior to Blue LA, and I think another complement is our publicly funded Metro bike sharing system. And that is a collaboration between Los Angeles, the city of Los Angeles, and our regional transportation agency. That system is non-contiguous for now. I think that speaks to the political geography of Los Angeles, as well as just kind of some of the different demand centers. And so we currently have 204 stations spread out across 3 main geographies: downtown Los Angeles, North Hollywood in the Valley, and the West Side, which includes, Venice Beach as an example. I think when you look at that project, and this is an old slide, but multiple years it took us to get to even just hit 1 million trips on that program. From when we look at kind of the peak, like the monthly peak for that system, you see it peaking around 30,000. I think we'll see a comparison of that a little bit later to the private office mobility sector, which we also regulate. And I think the one thing here is in our system, we've been, again, public sector, really trying to understand and invest so that we have a better understanding of KPIs of the sector, of what works, what doesn't. We're a little bit slower to kind of adapt, but I think we've steadily, and I think most recently, and I don't think it's a surprise to anyone here, is the utilization for our electric bikes that are part of that Metro Bike Share system, on average are like 8 times the use of the other different types of bikes that we have in the system that are non-pedal assist. And then the other one, I think what we've become most famous for, I think globally, is really our work around the dockless mobility program, which we just wrapped up our 1-year snapshot of that program. I think if you look at it at this map here, this is a screenshot in real time that was taken probably close to one of the heights of the program several months ago, definitely pre-COVID. But this kind of visualization shows again where those vehicles are spread out. This is a real-time shot at that point in time. And the system, we had at some point, I think, permitted 8 operators for a total of 36,000 dockless mobility devices. I showed that slide earlier about the Metro Bike Share program, and that had definitely more than a year, if not 2 or 3 years under its belt. This program in a year was able to scale to and achieve over 10 million rides. High utilization. I think the thing that really was the challenge with that was just the management of the public right-of-way, because of the fact that they're not station-based, rather they were on-demand, free-floating, which I think there was a big appeal to. Again, going back to this slide, and might relates a little bit to the conversation, and one of the questions that Carol posed was about data and the data sharing requirement. We can definitely get into a conversation later if anyone has any, but this was enabled by our development of the mobility data specification here in Los Angeles, which really was a prerequisite for us being able to scale the program to as large as it got, while being able to provide a level of certainty of right-of-way management to our political electeds, our city council members, and the public at large. And so I think this is, has a whole bunch of other contemplations and considerations. How do we use the data through just a compliance perspective? First and foremost, how do we protect that data? How do we make sure that we're preserving privacy and securing that data? And so this has been one of the richest data sets that we've had, that has been requested numerously. We're looking forward to, in the next couple months, actually publishing our first open data set that that both preserves privacy, but allows the public to really understand and play with, to start answering other research questions that are of interest to folks in the sector. So, you know, backing up just a second, what's allowed me to spend my time as the Chief Sustainability Officer working on shared mobility was a specific vision and from Mayor Garcetti, who really kind of laid out as part of his city's first ever sustainability plan, you know, was for LADOT, the Department of Transportation, to envision sustainability through specific projects and metrics. And one of those was increasing shared mobility trips in the city of Los Angeles, which has really kind of given me the mandate to move forward and support piloting and investing and using public dollars, but also at the same time, understanding the power of the private sector to leverage and to meet our goals much quicker, while making sure not to impact negatively the stakeholders and the communities where these services were being met. So the question is like, what now, right? I think there's still a tremendous amount of growth, right? We've, you know, just on the micromobility sector, some of our recommendations coming after that year one report had a lot to do with increasing equity and access. How do you actually use carrots and sticks to achieve outcomes that benefit low-income communities, older adults, people with limited mobility? And so we've definitely have had some pushback. COVID has not been friendly initially to this service, but I think they have bounced back fairly rapidly and are deploying widely in the city again. But we're going to be working with the industry to implement much more equity-based outcome requirements over the coming 6 months. But I think one of the things I wanted to kind of flag for y'all, because I could spend time showing you COVID data and kind of the impact on mobility, but I thought this would be helpful to kind of give you how a little bit of thinking about how we've been reframing our work, you know, here in Los Angeles, as I'm sure many cities across the world are suffering, right, from COVID, the economic impacts of COVID, the health impacts of COVID on transit and mobility and access, and also just what that means to our city budgets and our ability to subsidize and fund, and even for city staff, where we may be facing layoffs, we're definitely going to see a reduction in service hours through mandatory furloughs. And so this question at the top came from me from a colleague working with one of our mobility nonprofits here in Los Angeles. And they were asking me, hey, Marcel, we're really wanting to do a new mobility challenge, and we have some ideas, and we'd love you to give us some feedback. We're thinking specifically about posing a challenge about first mile, last mile, right? Or about, you know, cargo delivery. And so they said, can you get us something by Friday? And this was like literally yesterday. And we've been doing a lot of thinking internally. And my answer was this. I said, hey, Alex, it'd be a better service to kind of give you this lens of what we're looking at it, right? And as you talk to the private sector, as you talk to other folks looking to bring mobility opportunities here in LA, I can't even start to have a conversation about these projects if they don't do some of these following things. One, they address a real need, right? They're framed through a lens of racial equity. One of the things through COVID it's become abundantly clear that the kind of racial inequity, particularly as it relates to transportation investments, have been further magnified by COVID. You know, we also are interested in, do they provide a revenue generation for the city, opportunity for the city of LA? Do they support local community wealth building, right? Is there a local hire element? Is it a local business or business cooperative? Are there career ladders embedded into the work? and training opportunities through workforce development strategies. The other thing is, how do these innovations contemplate anti-displacement strategies, right? How can I go tell a community, hey, look what I'm bringing you this new opportunity for mobility when what they care about is being over policed in their community, or not having enough, not feeling safe, right? About not having a job. And so thinking about the anti-displacement piece. How does it build upon this concept that is really nascent, and some folks, I think famously Alex Roy has written about universal basic mobility, which is a spinoff of universal basic income. And then lastly, and I think really important, is how does the program, how does it contemplate, how does it include and support shared decision-making by community stakeholders living in those communities, right? And so that I think is, I showed you what we're doing, but this is really the lens in which we're working now, given where we're at in the city. And I think it's really important, and I think it's been incredible working alongside people and organizations and electeds, because I think this is the shared vision right now for the work that we need to do to improve the state of Angelenos and folks here in the city. So thank you, and looking forward to listening to the rest of the presentations and comments and questions.
Thank you so much, Marcel. I think you gave us a lot of food for thought, definitely for the discussion. So I thank you for that. And next up, we have Gregoire Bonin, who's the CEO and co-founder of PADAM Mobility. Gregoire, I'll leave you the floor.
Thank you very much, Carol. Coming online, I think my presentation should be live right now. Okay. Yes, thank you very much, Carol. So I'm very happy to present today in front of this crowd, this virtual crowd. I'm going to take just a couple of minutes to explain, of course, who is PADAM Mobility, and then explain a bit more about how we can use DRT, how public authorities can use DRT to minimize the social, to make progress on the social impact and environmental impact of mobility. Just in a nutshell, PADAM Mobility is a startup. We're based in France, in Paris. We are a team of more than 45 people now in engineering, software engineering, transport planning, and we are an independent company working with most transit operators on the market, and public authorities, as well as some private partners such as Siemens and CETEC, who are also shareholders of PADAM Mobility. Our main focus is demand responsive transit, or on-demand transit. It's a very versatile mode of transport. It's as we can see here on this map, it's something that can be used for many different use cases, and that's why it can answer many needs on any territory. It's been used for some time, of course, to manage the movements of people with impaired mobility, so paratransit, but also in the most rural, low-density areas. And as we're going to see, it's now the use cases of DRT have expanded. We already talked a lot, thanks to Marcel, about first last mile mobility. This is becoming a huge use case for DRT, but also off-peak hours, replacement services, shuttles for airports, companies, and so on. We offer a technology for DRT. I'm not going to talk about our technology today. If you are interested, just come to us. So we just deliver this technology as white label turnkey technology to the public authorities or transit operators to manage DRT services efficiently. We are probably at the moment the fastest growing startup in DRT in Europe. We've been implementing tons of services, in France and in Europe, all over Europe. And I'm just going to reflect on a couple of them during my presentation here. So the reason we built this company is really to make a step forward in terms of shared mobility and how we can improve shared mobility and make it more prominent in any territory to really manage the impact of mobility. So I think Marcel made a very good case on why, of course, mobility has a very strong social impact, in particular, considering the access to jobs for low-income households. So I'm just going to reflect also on the environmental part. It's really at the core of our vision at PADAM Mobility that we're in a world where we have constantly growing mobility needs. And at the same time, we are all aware that we are having decreasing resources and it will decrease faster and faster in the future. And we also need to reduce the footprint of these trips we're taking every day. So it's like a paradox, but the only way for us to solve that paradox is really to take care of shared mobility. As we very well know now, just replacing gas engines with electric engines and so on, if we keep having 1 or 2 cars per household, this will not solve our problems. So we are really committed to working on shared mobility by actually leveraging some piece of technology. And to show how that's relevant for a public authority to think about that, I would like to give the example of Paris. So Paris is, of course, very different city than Los Angeles. It's the core of Paris is very dense, so it's been some time already that people have widely abandoned cars within Paris to move within Paris. But we still see a lot of congestion and a lot of cars actually in Paris and the suburb. When you look at what's happening now in Paris, is there are so many ways to move around within Paris in the core that the only 0.4 million Paris to Paris trips that still take place in private cars, these are really a choice. I mean, people who take their car to do that kind of trips, they have like 20 other modes of transport at their disposal. So, I mean, it's not going to be a new solution that will help. I mean, it's our what we believe in at least is that in such a dense area, it's not by providing yet another solution that we will solve the problem, but it's a different topic for the people who actually live in the suburb, because there we have, of course, some train stations. We have a quite good network, but it's still very difficult for people to do their entire trip with public transportation. And usually for these people who still rely on the car, the private car is more of the only option, or maybe the most convenient option at least. And that's why the Paris region has invested in the last 18 months in a very ambitious demand responsive transit scheme to solve the problem for these people. So it's really by helping them cover the first and last mile leg of their trip that these people are able then to connect to the actual public transit network and to go to Paris, for instance, to work. So that's the reason why the Paris region invested. And in the last 15 months, for example, together with them, so as they have selected our technology, we've deployed already 21 areas all over the suburb, including a few areas post lockdown, which is good. It's still growing, and we expect to still still deploy another 20 areas probably in the next 2 to 3 years. So this is helping a lot, of course, solving the reliance on private cars and actually solving the congestion within Paris to invest in this DRT service. Another example would be in Strasbourg, so in the east of France. It's the same, really the same idea. We're having here a service which connects with the tramway, for instance, and in just a few months, we went from 0 to 1,000 trips per week. We have also recovered now to the same level as before the lockdown in France in the past weeks. And thanks to an all-electric fleet, of course, this is a really sustainable alternative to the modes of transport that people could use before. So this was, of course, this is interesting, but it was not really sufficient for us to have interesting ridership on DRT. This is a success for us as a company, but what we're really trying to understand is, are we actually solving the problem of the reliance on cars? So we started to ask the question directly to the users, as we were lacking some data on this actually. And we came out with a survey with already 250 answers. And what we realized is that the people who use these DRT services, that's from a few of the cities where we operate, most of the households have cars already. And this is interesting for us because we want to offer a service which is, of course, available for the households with low income, because that may be the only option that they have to move. But we also want to provide a service which is attractive for people with, for wealthier households, which could decide to use cars. But of course, if all the wealthy households out there use cars just because they can, just because they have the purchasing power to do so, then we're not going to solve our problem. So this is really interesting to see that here the services that we're deploying are attractive enough to really compete with cars. That's the key message. The other key message that we took out, and this is going to reflect to the issues that you pointed out, Carol, in the beginning. Most of the trips are also taken in connection with other modes of transport. So this is showing that it's really key to have a DRT service which is integrated in the rest of the public transit network. So I'm not talking here about all the data, the work that we have to do to connect these DRT services with the rest, but just as an example, at PADAM Mobility, we worked with already several of the leading companies in journey planning and Maas to integrate DRT so that people can really plan a trip from A to B, which comprises maybe part of DRT and part of train, bus, tramway, etc. So this is already possible, but there's still a lot of work at an international level to come up with the standards to make that even easier to implement in the future. So I'm going to finish with also some other data that we recovered from asking questions to more our direct customers, so public authorities, transport operators, to understand what are maybe the blocking points which make it difficult for these stakeholders to implement DRT. What's important to them. We realized that so at the moment we could think that the environmental friendliness is a key fact. I guess it's progressing, but it's still low, and people still see DRT as very convenient for users, which, as I said in the beginning, just earlier, is interesting as it's showing that it can really compete with private cars, which are seen as convenient as well. Another key fact is that the top obstacle for people to deploy DRT is still the complexity of deployment. In a world where we have many SaaS solutions, this may be surprising, but of course DRT is still a bit young. So this is also one thing that we're focusing with our clients to help them make it easier for them to deploy DRT services. And the last insight we can share today is that to support public authorities, transport operators into actually deploying these services, we're coming back to the data that we need to share to show when, where, and how DRT can be efficient. There has been a lot of pilots out there about DRTs. Many have been very successful, some have failed, and we need to understand, of course, in which cases DRT is a good solution and how it should be implemented. And that comes also with some know-how to design those services. For instance, to check how they are integrated and interfaced with the other modes of transport in a public network. So these are the most the insights we wanted to share today. And the conclusion for me would be to also share with the people here today that DRT is actually something that can be taken step by step quite easily. It's a very flexible mode of transport, and we actually have customers who start with one vehicle, so with very, very little risk, financial risk. And apart from starting with a low volume and then scaling, there are also some steps to take which allow you to reduce the risk again of having a failed deployment. And one step we would especially recommend is to start with simulations, with a feasibility study to understand how we can answer the local needs, how we can use the data that we have at our disposal to plan to build the right DRT service, which will then convince users and will be able to scale.
Thank you very much, Gregoire. Excellent thoughts, particularly one of your last thoughts about really understanding what works and what doesn't work. As you said, there have been many, many successful pilots, but there have been some not so successful. What have we learned from that? So I look forward to talking about that a little bit more. But in the interest of time, let's move on to our next presenter, who is Rahul Kumar, the Executive Vice President of Market Development and Innovation for the Keolis Group. So I'll hand it over to you, Rahul.
Thank you so much, Carol, and hopefully everyone can hear me and see me. Great. Again, thanks, Carol, and thanks to my previous panelists who are talking really eloquently about the impacts of both technology and social change. The topic I really wanted to bring to the table as we're talking about on-demand and tech-enabled mobility is the integration with public transit. I've spent half of my 20+ years in this industry on the public transit side, and the other half on the transit side. We built an on-demand solution when I was running a startup in France, an incubator in France, and then came here to North Carolina to work at a startup that we actually ended up selling to Ford Motor Company that was about on-demand transportation. But really what it comes down to isn't just the tech-enabled mobility, it's the integration of that tech-enabled mobility into transit, as I said a second ago, but also how important transit is into the social and economic frameworks of our societies. similar to Gregoire's presentation, you know, we've
Rahul,
been sort of, yes,
Can I just interrupt you for 1
please.
second? Your slides are showing in the notes mode. We're
Oh,
getting 2 slides,
no problem.
so
No
that would be
problem at
great.
all.
Make it a
If
little
you
bit
could,
easier on the audience.
yep, no problem at all. Wasn't that way a second ago, so we'll
Right.
we'll go ahead
Technology
and
being what it is.
right. And here you're seeing what? Are you seeing the main screen?
We've got 1 slide and now we're back to 2 slides.
Okay. So let's do this. Why don't we, Carol, if you don't mind, why don't I go next and I'll come back and fix this and we'll skip to the next presenter and I'll come back and do the last one. Is that okay?
That's fine with me.
Perfect. Thank you.
We're flexible. So, all right, Hans, you're up next. So Hans Arby, who's the CEO of Ubigo. The floor
Yes.
is yours.
So hopefully you see,
Looks good, Hans.
yeah, hang on a second.
Okay.
So you can see and hear me?
I can't see the slides anymore. I
Okay.
can see you fine.
Oh, that's a good start, maybe.
All right, we're almost there.
Yeah. How about now?
Beautiful. Thank
Thank
you
you.
so much.
So thank you for having me on this panel. I'm Hans Arby. I'm founder of Ubigo, which is one of the very few commercial Maas operators. So we are currently active in Stockholm, where we offer a subscription-based service that includes all public transport, car sharing, car rental, taxi, and bikes. So we want to be one-stop shop for all the mobility needs of a household in order to be able to replace the private car. So we're looking more at solving the sum of trips rather than each trip. Maas, or mobility as a service, it's a widely used term. For me, Maas, and actually most of all the new mobility services, is about offering an easy everyday life without having to own a car. And this means that it need to be at least as easy to combine different modes during the days as it is to always use your private car. That also means that we're widening the scope from single trips. So it's not about getting from A to B, it's more about getting from morning to evening, from Monday to Sunday, from January to December, covering all the A's and B's. Because if we can't do that, a household might then hold on to their car or buy the car. And once they have done that, they will use the private car. They should use it. Because if you look at the cost of having a car, it's the largest portion is the fixed cost. So you're really stupid if you don't use your car as much as possible. So buying the car is the big decision that will influence all the following small decisions. So that's why we target that one. Adapting to customer needs, well, it's a cliche, but it's if we must be able to build trust and be the mobility partner of the household, and always be relevant, offering the right mix of services, team up with the right partners, ensuring the right service level, and be good at support and so on. So it's much, much more than offering an information and booking platform. So it's only by covering all the needs then that we can minimize the need for owning a car. And it's just by getting rid of all the private cars that we can free up space, lowering emission, easing the congestion and so on. So just a crash course in Maas. I think some of you might have seen this before. But it's a way of explaining the different type of Maas in order to avoid some confused discussions sometimes. So it takes a more of a user and business perspective rather than technical on Maas. And the different levels also imply different business models, different target groups, possible effects, and so on. So in the first level, it's about integrating information, typically a multimodal travel planner like Google, which is the best example. The next level, we also integrate the possibility to book and pay for the trips and tickets. And that we see like in Vmobil, Jelby in Berlin, Zipster in Singapore, Skipper in Belgium, and so on. And third level, it's about integrating the service offer in itself, typically a subscription-based. To my knowledge, it's right now us and Maas Global with WIM that offer this kind of service. And this also corresponds to the relationship with the customer. So you can say the first level, it's about making sure that the information is correct. The second level is that the ticket and payment is correct. And the third level is actually the quality of the service. And if the first level is the business model is making money on advertising, the second one is commission. It's quite tough. And the third level is more about being the all-inclusive charter trip of everyday mobility. And the level 4 is integration of societal goals. And that's up to the city and other authorities to make sure that the outcome of the Maas service is really as sustainable as you would like. So it's from a city operating on the individual service level to make it easier for car sharing to have parking. You have parking policy, congestion charging, licensing, and so on. And for companies like us, it's up to the PTA to say, okay, you are allowed to resell our service if you can show that you reach new customer, that it's revenue neutral, increased ridership, and so on. And also, when we look at what happened now, and I mean, as everybody else, we've been affected by the pandemic. We saw a decline in public transport from our customers up to 70%, but we also saw an increase in car sharing. Many more bookings, but shorter bookings to take care of all the errands, and also more weekend rentals. So for us, it's really about staying relevant for the customer to make them stay in the service domain, remain in sharing mode, so to say, so we not lose them to car ownership, because then we kind of lose them forever. So we do this by, I mean, the good thing about having a broad offer and not just relying on one service is that if it's like being a department store, if customer lose interest in one category of products, there will always be other products that they will come back for. And if consider, well, given if they like the store and they know that it's possible to find everything with us. You can add new services. We added a monthly bike rent, quite similar to the Dutch swap feed. So it's not the classical bike share in the city center, but it's more a bike that you park at home and use for commuting, which we have very big interest in. And maybe we should offer the same monthly rent for cars or e-scooters, because it's better. They will use more cars, but they will not buy a car, and that's the important thing. We already have flexible subscription. That means for public transport, you subscribe to a number of days in public transport that you share among the household. What you haven't used, you can save to the next month. And if you need extra, you pay according to your plan. And this also means that we didn't have to refund any monthly passes or lose customers completely. They could just scale down and stay with us. But of course, we're really waiting for return on mass transit, because that's the backbone of our service. Even before Corona, we had 95% of all the bookings were public transport, and now we're down to 75. So even though we don't make money on public transport, it need to be taking care of the bulk of the trips in order to be cost effective. So when we look at the need and challenge for, I mean, all the first and last mile solution and demand responsive is, from our perspective of being an aggregator, it's for growing the market of shared services. We are relying on good access to public transport. And in a typical city, that may be 25–50% of the households. The only way we can expand that market is to offer better first last mile services, and also the A to B services off peak. Then we can expand into other areas as well. What is important, of course, is that you get good physical and mental integration. We don't really want to change mode during a trip. So it's very interesting that Gregory showed that actually the customers are doing that, and that's very good. But you need to have that good layout and so on the hubs and stations. So it's not just possible to change mode, but it's actually attractive to change mode. And you need to have that mental integrations. You do one search, you do one payment, so it's really connected. The biggest problem is, of course, a viable business model, because it will cost more per passenger kilometer. So if you replace underused buses, that's a saving. But if you expand the network with these services and offer also off-peak services, that will cost, and somebody has to pay, whether it be the user, the city, PDA's employer. And so the question is the user prepared to pay? And are we willing to use more public funding? Because that's also a question of the equity. Because should we spend more public money on convincing wealthy people to leave their car in their suburb, actually subsidizing the wealthy more than other groups? What would be very interesting to see if we will see a growing acceptance of peer-to-peer, whether it's the ride sharing or renting your neighbor's car. I haven't seen any survey, anything of this. I don't know if you have, Carol, but it's going to be interesting, because I hope and I have a feeling that people will be more accepting, have a different attitude to sharing private resources as well. That would also help us. And finally, when we look at sharing and using data, also from our perspective of being the aggregator, that every service provider should share the data. That's kind of a given. And I think the best example is LA. with an MDS standard, which also helps easier for the providers because it's got the same standard in all the cities, hopefully. But I mean, everybody using the public floor or subsidized public services need to pay back in some way. What I think is important is not to overdo it, building a very advanced platform. It's about having some kind of data lake with rights management and so on, but don't try to build a transactional platform with a travel planner that everybody has to use, integrating booking and everything, because that will scare many actors away, I think, and it will cost a lot of money. And also realizing that it's not only about sharing data from the public sector. We want to be able to integrate public transport into our offer. And that will say maybe for event companies, hotels, chains, banks, and whatever, we want to have public transport should be present everywhere in all the apps and all the platforms, and maybe also parking and some other services. And finally, ending with another cliche, it's a lot of talk about sharing data, but in order to kind of change the ecosystem and really tapping into the blue ocean of car ownership, we need to start realize that we need to share customer, not just data. We need to create the market to get more people out of the car and into the service domain, and then be able to share those customers among us. So thank you for listening. I'm looking forward to the discussions.
Thank you very much, Hans. You touched on a number of really, really good discussion points that we'll come back to in a little
Thank you.
bit. So let's go back to Rahul, and we'll hear your presentation. The floor is yours.
Thank you. And we should be good to go now, right?
It looks great. Thank you.
Okay, fantastic. Apologies about that earlier. This is the fun part of technology. So, as I started to say, as Gregor has done with PADAM, we looked into our customers in the transit industry and tried to figure out what are the biggest challenges facing them. Overwhelmingly, over the last 8 months, COVID-19, the coronavirus, has been the #1 issue. As we've started to see, not just in the United States and Canada, but throughout the globe, services start being restored, we're back to where we were before COVID in terms of some of the many issues that are facing public transportation, which is declining ridership, the uncertainty around funding, specifically here in the US. We have obviously, you may not know, but we have some kind of political disarray here in our country. And so disruption of social services are in question. And then really it comes down to user experience. I think one of the things that tech companies do really well is focus on the user experience. And this is something that I think public transit can learn from. And it's that user experience that I really want to hone in on. Disruption of public transit was inevitable. Travel habits of riders are changing, whether it's more teleworkers like we have here in the US, even pre-COVID. We have an aging population that needs different types of services, different types of modes at different times of the day. We have a whole slew of new types of work relations and social interactions that people are doing right now, and varying densities of cities. All I heard for the first 10 years of my career is how everyone is moving to a mega city. Well, what we're seeing here, at least in the United States, and I know in other parts of the world where mega cities are becoming so unaffordable, this suburban urbanization, this idea that we can create central business districts in suburbs. And to be perfectly frank, public transit just can't keep up with these kind of varying changes. And it hasn't always been that way. It wasn't more than 15 years ago where the only ways you got around a city were public transit, walking, or your own personal vehicle or a taxi. And in those days, the cities and the transit agencies controlled the policy. They dictated how the services would be performed and where they would go and who they would go to. But we all know, 15 years ago when the smartphone and the information age started, the power of demand was put into the hands of the user. You could order your pizza in 30 minutes or less. You could order toilet paper in 2 days or less. And then pretty soon you could order a taxi in 8 minutes or less. And that power of demand is extremely important and has fundamentally changed the experience of mobility. But it has bifurcated and disintermediated the policymakers in the transit industry. So what are the impacts of that? This is something I like to call the design gap. And in our prep, we talked about equity. And the design gap is really a visual representation of inequity. When we see new modes being developed, they're tech enabled and they are really powerful. We're hearing some amazing things that are coming out of these and new value creation. However, they're for the haves. In the United States, 67% of users of public transportation are members of our Black and Brown communities. And we in this community, by and large, 3/4 of this community makes less than $40,000 US per year. And there is a digital divide. We've seen this with COVID and homeschooling, where kids don't have access to internet at home or high-speed internet at home. We're seeing this with people with reduced mobility and those with disabilities that cannot access an Uber wheelchair accessible vehicle and must rely on a slower and more expensive to the city public transportation solution. So it really comes down to why transit cannot keep up with these tech-enabled changes. And it's this ongoing fight of coverage versus frequency, this push and pull where transit tries to be everything to everyone, but because they can't afford it, they can't provide a good enough service. Fast, frequent service. I was on a panel with the CEO of Uber 7 or 8 years ago, maybe even longer than that. And aside from lambasting public transportation, he would say that he will not offer a business that does not provide cars in less than 8 minutes. If anybody waits more than 8 minutes, people won't use the service. And public transportation just can't keep up with that. So the ongoing question I always hear, is public transit dead? And I can say this unequivocally, no, it's not. And it can't die, because public transportation is the only mode across the world that has a mandate to provide equitable, accessible mobility, right? Tech companies, while doing amazing work, don't have that mandate. They don't have to provide wheelchair accessible vehicles, or they don't have to provide equal access to lower socioeconomic demographics. But these guidelines were created decades ago. So really, it comes down to, how do we make sure that when we deploy these technologies, which are good and can modernize and evolve public transportation, that we do so in an equitable and accessible fashion. And the way we look at things is first and foremost, understanding the riders, knowing the way they move, the more importantly, the why of their movement, right? We know when a person is riding transit, we know where they're going because they're on the route. They're a captive market, but we don't know why. We can't understand, Carol, why did you choose Route 7 today? Or why did Gregoire choose Route 13 tomorrow? We don't understand that. So we need to understand their travel patterns, their habits, then select the technology. Again, amazing technologies that are out there, more than, I grew up as a scheduler and a planner in this business, and we used to ride routes and follow buses and talk to passengers. You can do all of that from Google today. You don't even need to interact with the services. And then ultimately, and one of the things I learned from my days in startup is the importance of iterative innovation. And you can only do that when you're measuring and managing properly. And this is how you can start integrating new technologies with public transportation. I talked about this idea of coverage versus frequency. Well, with on-demand transit zones integrated into a fixed route system, you can service low density transit deserts and food deserts. You can do first mile, last mile feeders, as we just saw in a presentation or two ago. And then importantly, we can address new work patterns. I know I've seen this, at least in the United States, and I lived in Paris for some time. We don't have peaks in traffic anymore. In pre-COVID, you would have an AM peak and then a flattening off of the services. So you would see traffic just about all day. That means people are riding all day and have needs for different modes all day. We here at Keolis, when we're partnering with technology companies, we have kind of a 5 item criteria that each technology provider needs to bring to the table. One is an algorithm that can be dispatched and changed in real time, a rapid implementation. One of the key issues with public transportation not evolving fast enough is this need to think and paralysis through analysis. We need to get this out quickly, pilot it and test it and make sure that it's in the hands of customers and see what works. It has to be compatible with various fleets. We can't just bring non-wheelchair accessible vehicles or vehicles that only cater to, they have leather seats and high floors. They cater to wealthy customers. It's got to be able to be transversal across the different assets the public transit agency has. It has to be customizable, and it's got to be at a price point. And this is, unfortunately, and I'll talk about this in just a couple of slides, we have measured transit in 2 ways. One is the frequency of how people take the service. So we call that ridership. And second is cost, right? Those are really the 2 biggest measures. There are some service quality indicators like on-time performance and maintenance and things like that. But ultimately it comes down to how many butts in seats and how much does it cost to carry each one of those people. We need to fundamentally rethink how we're measuring public transportation and its effectiveness. I'll give an example of a demand responsive or on-demand microtransit service that we launched in Orange County, California. And it's a great service. It has really picked up riders. They've expanded zones, and they've had steady growth. But as I said just a second ago, we need to measure things differently. And one of the ways that we're looking at things is to look at the effectiveness of transit, and that's measured through about 8 different criteria, and one of which is experience. So we need to look at things like, how much time would it take if you were to drive or take traditional public transit versus a demand responsive or tech-enabled mode. But just as important is ensuring that that tech-enabled mode services the areas that are either lower socioeconomic, economically challenged, or that they are in communities where people don't have access to a vehicle, and that there's accessibility. You know, it's not just about putting the transit out there or the demand responsive transit out there. It's ensuring that that transit is accessible. So people don't have to walk too far. People know when they walk up to a stop with a flexible on-demand service that it can pick them up in a reasonable amount of time. So it's not, again, just about the ridership and the cost. It's about ensuring that the service is effective across a multitude of factors. And when we do that, we really come down to this kind of virtuous cycle where policymakers continue to set the policy. We have modes like public transit in core parts of the service. They are integrated and enabled by tech-enabled mobility. The idea that all of these services can work together, and I think LADOT with their MDS is a phenomenal creation, and it's just scratching the surface of what we can do when we integrate policy with technology. And I'm really looking forward to seeing the rest of the presenters.
Thank you so much, Raul. So, a couple of key points from your presentation that I really appreciate. One of them is travel behavior and how we really need to understand that. And I feel that we often gloss over that as something, oh, we already know what the behavior is, but frankly, we need to understand the impact of these kinds of services on travel behavior. And the other is sort of the issue again about KPIs. How do we measure success? How do we measure knowing that we've made a change in travel behavior or that the service is being utilized the way we think it should be? So now, last but absolutely not least, is Philip Ellis, who is the founder and CEO of Viril. And I will give you the floor, Philip, for our last presentation before the discussion. You're on mute, Philip.
Right, sorry, there we go. That you should be able to hear me now, is that right?
I can hear you and your presentation is up on the screen. Thank you.
Great. Well, thanks very much. Yeah, so I've got this presentation, although what I talk about may slightly differ from what's on screen because I want to react and sort of flow on from some of the things that the other presenters have talked about. But just to start off with a bit of background, I'll introduce Beryl. So Beryl is a micromobility provider. So we're sort of bookending the presentations with a couple of micromobility thoughts with some DRT in the middle. So yeah, we're a UK-based micromobility provider. We're a team of about 70 people. And actually in the world of micromobility, we're relative grandfathers in that we've been around since 2012, and we sort of we built up alongside the industry really. First of all, launching consumer products really with a hypothesis that, you know, cycling and two-wheeled, self-propelled, as we thought, two-wheeled transport in cities was only going to become more and more significant in how people will be getting around cities. And, you know, we wanted to create products, and particularly safety products, that helped people and encouraged people to make those sorts of journeys. And then we started working with big, complicated bike share systems, implementing some of our products and technology. So we worked with the TfL bike share system in London, New York bike share, what was it called, the city bike share system in New York, and one in Montreal, and a couple of other cities. And each time sort of developing more products and more technology, until it got to a point really for us in around 2017, 2018, 2017, when there was a real big sort of booming going on within micromobility and a proliferation of companies very well funded delivering the service. And we actually thought through our apprenticeship, as it were, in being a supplier to some of the big complicated bike share systems, we sort of thought we knew quite a lot about how micromobility systems can be run, but with a background in consumer products, we sort of also thought the needs of the consumers weren't really being focused on, and from a city perspective, we thought there was some delivery elements that were probably lacking in some of those early deployments in big micromobility deployments. And so we thought, well, yeah, we have an opportunity to meet all of those challenges through some of the products and technology that we've developed. And so that's when we began launching our own services. So we now so that's just an example of the product that we became most well known for initially, which was the laser light, a safety device, which we have equipped on various third-party bike share systems. So then, yeah, we really built that up from there to a point now where we are providing the entire platform for running bike share, e-bike share, and scooter share, and cargo bike share systems. And we've done all of that in-house, partly because we grew up over a number of years and added different strings to our bow into being in the position we are now, where we're able to offer everything under one umbrella. But also because we quite strongly think that what the industry has demonstrated is that the micromobility systems, to be really successful, it does need to be delivered with a strong understanding of what each location needs and what each city or transport authority wants. So a sort of idea of like a one-size-fits-all mass scalable micromobility service that can just proliferate around the world in an instant somewhat has demonstrated itself not to quite be right. And so for us, we're also now sort of working with third-party operators who might be better equipped to use certain elements of our platform to deliver a better service in their location. So there'll be other operators with better connections to a city authority, or a better understanding of a public transport network within a city, or a better understanding of how to serve different communities within a city than us. And so, yeah, we also now, as many of the DRT providers have spoke about, provide elements of our platform for delivering these services. These are the schemes that we run, so a few there throughout the country in the UK. These are a few of the systems that we enable through our technology. And indeed, over the course of this year, we are building up to a launch of a shared micromobility system in New York City with the Department of Transport there, on Staten Island, and also looking at a few other areas. So I guess, yeah, the topic for discussion being technology, I thought I'd better put in some content that visualizes technology. And this is sort of purposely meant to be a bit of an ugly slide, because I guess what I'm trying to, the point I'm trying to make is, it's the technology that underpins these services is trying to do different things for different people, and it has to be understood through the lens of whoever is using that information and using that technology. So of course, analysis for the city in understanding how investments in micromobility are actually servicing the long-term transport strategies that a city might have. We are also, in line with what people have spoken about here in terms of provision of data. As an operator, we're sort of in a good position now where there's things like MDS or GBFS and things like that we can just spew out our data, and then there's Maas plumbing that can ingest it. And if all of those things work well, we really don't have to think too hard about the physical or technological process that goes on there. But obviously, it's an important part of what we want to be able to do, and then we can concentrate on delivering technology, both hardware and software, that makes delivering our service even better. And really, like, that's what technology for us in micromobility services is doing, is delivering magic for the customer. I think that there's some sort of famous quote around sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic, and there's certain things that within micromobility that sort of do deliver a similar customer experience and a similar level of delight as magic, especially now as we're introducing some more e-vehicles that give people the perception of superpowers when they're moving. I guess the other thing for us, though, is stepping forward from where micromobility has come from, and like how we want to make use of technologies we've developed and technologies that we can plumb into, is then how do we actually think about what that means for the city and the users in the city. And I guess for us, we've done this in a whole variety of ways, I think. But I think one thing that's worth going into a little bit more for us is the physical place where we are delivering these services from. So we call them barrel bays in our cities, and our whole sort of doctrine around the barrel bays is led by a hierarchy that puts pedestrians at the top of the tree in terms of the street users. Once you're decoupling the need for big, heavy physical docking infrastructure from delivering a bike share service or a micromobility shared service, you can have a opportunity to rethink what the space that you're delivering these services from should be. So obviously, like, there's hygiene factors that we need to deliver, and with an eye on racial equity and social equity, it's imperative that we put the bays in the right places throughout the city, and designing of the scheme is an important part of making sure that this service is accessible to a whole group of people. But there's a hygiene factor in literally keeping the pedestrian pavements clear and free of clutter. And accurate geofencing is something that we've always done, and something that we've always been able to do by virtue of working quite closely with city authorities. And I think that's one sort of learning for us with delivering these micromobility services is two things really. If you invest sufficiently in the technology, you can have accurate geofencing, which means you are putting these bikes in a controlled place, and you can implement incentivized pricing to make sure people are parking their e-scooters or e-bikes where you want them to. But as soon as you go down that track, it means that you're slowing down your deployment. And this is something that we've very consciously done, because it means you can't just agree with a city to start operations. You have to agree with the city to start operations, and then begin at least a 4-month, probably a 6-month, maybe longer program of identifying the bays, working through how you will determine where the bays should be to promote accessibility, engaging with the local stakeholders for those people who are going to be affected by it, and also physically implementing them. And of course, then this is what gets quite interesting for us, is you can have a very light touch physical implementation, such as the one in this photo here, which takes somebody with appropriate paint and skills 20 minutes to install, or something, and is light and flexible, agnostic to what vehicle you're parking into it, and very quick to deploy. Or it can give you the opportunity to implement some things that really for us sort of bridge the gap between people who are walking in a city and people who are then choosing to go a little bit further on a bike or an e-bike or an e-scooter. And really, this is quite an important part of how we've sort of almost done a little bit of a full circle, you could say, but powered by technology and powered by our understanding of how people want to be using these sorts of services, is that you can sort of scrub out the need for any physical infrastructure and just deploy the thing that people are going to use. but that invites other challenges and doesn't then solve some of the, it invites other challenges. And so, what we do is try to implement a piece of physical infrastructure on the ground that serves a purpose to more than just that one person or two person or three people who might be sort of docking or undocking a scooter or a bike per day, depending on the utilization that you have, and actually something that provides a little bit of pleasant urban greening, building healthy streets initiatives. Out of shot on this photo is some seating and an area that sort of bridges the gap between pedestrians and people using these services. And of course, what you get into then is you're sort of on a trajectory towards physical infrastructure that meets more and more needs, and perhaps towards mobility hub type thinking. It's easy to imagine how something like this expands beyond to integrate with DRT services or integrate with leisure elements. It integrates with, even more leisure parklets and pocket parks and things of that nature. And then I think, I wanted just to mention something about scooters as well, because the thing that's interesting here is this is definitely an example of technology delivering something that feels like magic, because it is quite it is quite magic when you get on these things and they go. And I think now is an interesting time for micromobility, with I think everybody accepting a need for a period of probably rational growth and maturity in how these systems are deployed, and now is a really good time, and indeed a necessary time, to do that. The vehicles that people are using, thanks to the fierce competition that has existed, means that the vehicles have really rapidly evolved, and it means now that many of these vehicles that are out there are actually quite good, and the initial sort of hurdle that micromobility companies face from a financial point of view is largely speaking solved in terms of a depreciation of the assets. I think that comes on to something that perhaps we'll have opportunity to talk about in the panel at the end here, which is sort of marrying together the financial models of these sorts of things with actual delivery and managed delivery, and indeed KPI delivery of these sorts of services. And I guess I would just take the opportunity as well, as I've said here, to think about, while this is a talk about sort of technology, and I witnessed this in one of our schemes on Monday with 17, 18-year-olds, able-bodied, walking right past something that for them didn't really have any connotations with digital features and technology, walking straight past a mechanical bike and going for an electric scooter, and sort of thinking there, well, there's some public policy and public health externalities that we need to consider about balancing the services that we're delivering and the economic models that underpin delivery of a shared micromobility service, to make sure that actually those guys are using the vehicles that might be more accessible to them, such as a bike, but for whatever reason, and this is something the industry needs to crack, they're not that interested in doing that right now. And I think starting with the digital natives and figuring out how to deploy services that are effective is an interesting challenge for companies such as ourselves. And that is my presentation.
Philip, thank you so much. And I want to thank all of our speakers for some really fantastic information. And in the interest of time, what I would like to go back to a question that was actually asked of Marcel. Let me just go back to that, and we'll continue the panel discussion. Marcel, the question was, prior to expanding the large car sharing program targeting the disadvantaged community, how long was this under consideration?
I don't think very long. It wasn't under consideration very long. I think it was born out of the mayor's office of sustainability. And it was at a point in time where the mayor had been recently elected, probably youngest mayor in the history of the city, an environmentalist, and he went about building the city's first robust sustainability team and implementing the city's first sustainability plan. And so there was a lot of, and his first chief sustainability officer, Matt Peterson, had formerly founded Global Green and, hung out with Leonardo DiCaprio. And so there was already like a gravitas out of that office that enabled kind of this innovation. And we partnered and were able to leverage some California, state of California funding from the cap and trade proceeds aimed at GHG reduction in low-income communities. And so it was really quick. And we just happened to have the right people in place. I was actually on the transportation team at that point in time. And so it was just just one of those things that just happens, right? And but we've been really working and seeing how we can continue to grow it into the next iteration.
That's great. Thank you, Marcel. Appreciate that. And I'm going to give credit to Hans before our session when we were thinking about various discussion topics. And some of you really already addressed this, but Hans, I'm going to start with you. What are the biggest challenges for offering on-demand services in sort of this seamless environment, given what everybody has talked about? We didn't talk a lot about the challenges, and I know there are a number of them. And I'm going to actually tie that to a poll that was done of our audience. But Hans, if you could sort of address that a little bit for a minute or two, that would be awesome.
Yeah, well, there's a lot of challenges, or if not, we wouldn't need to be here, I guess. But I mean, one thing is what we're doing, I think all of us is doing, is trying to transform a not perfect ecosystem where technology is maybe just one piece. It is complex because you have private, public, you need to have private-public cooperation, which is always complex. It's always very local. The condition in every city is very different. You have the problem with the typical business model problem where value can be created somewhere, but it's need to be captured somewhere else, and you need to look at how to fund it. But also then I think that sometimes, Maas is sometimes called Netflix for mobility, and it's a big difference of having a pure digital product. And I mean, it's a lot of difference to move kilograms of flash or kilobytes of data. It's completely different. You have high margin costs, like in all transport, typically a low margin market. And also that it's a very siloed market where a lot of actors prefer to stick with a few customers they have instead of wanting to expanding the market and start sharing customers. So it's really, it's many challenges.
Definitely. In sort of along that same vein, I was thinking through all of the presentations, and a few of them mentioned what is really the financial viability of the product. There have been, as several of you mentioned, there have been a lot of pilots that have gone well, some haven't. But how can we look at this in the long term, given some of the challenges associated with funding and a lot of other services vying for the same funding as on-demand services? So Philip, let me ask you that first.
Thanks. Yeah, I guess starting point for this would be, what our transport authority customers tell us, which is, well, for the last 10 years, they've been telling us they're completely broke. And now they're more than that, of course. And so then I think there's a real interesting balance that we see, sort of from a, like, balancing the sort of externalities, negative, positive externalities that come from these modes. So for me, a bike and a bike share system is something that I think the industry has demonstrated itself that it would need subsidy for it to run, whereas an electric scooter share system is a service that might not necessarily need a subsidy for it to run. And indeed, it might even be possible for a city to make revenue out of it. But then I guess the risk with that is balancing that with how do you make that viable in a way that is like in line with the equity principles that need to be upheld. Like electric shared scooter systems are, at the point of use for a consumer, really expensive, and so therefore presumably they are highly exclusive. And you see that in like demographic surveys of who's using these things. And so I guess I'm slightly worried about, well, if a city can deliver it, now it's all been lumped into like micromobility. A city can deliver its micromobility requirement for free or at profit, but the only really way the industry so far has demonstrated itself to be able to do that is by delivering expensive shared scooter services. We're a bit of a catch-22. And so that's why I kind of think, unless you are a mega city like LA or New York or Paris or London, you can, there are, if you're not one of those, I'll come back to those. If you're not one of those, you probably need to be looking at a service that you are either subsidizing the bikes for, or you are allowing a sort of exclusive contract to the operator in which requires them to deliver, a mix of modes, and that it means that you can deliver things that obviously have nice active travel and public health benefits, like encouraging people onto the bikes, but the practical economics of having a bike means it is cheaper, that you can offer that far cheaper to the end customer. It should have some KPIs in there to ensure that the scheme is designed in a way that the locations that are being served are good. And finally, if we're assuming there is some level of either there's some level of subsidy if it's a bike or e-bike only shared system, why not make it sort of more outcome based? So for example, we have some schemes where we basically get paid incrementally, and like technology enables this, we get paid incrementally every time somebody uses our bike. So if we charge somebody £1 to make that journey, the city will then also give us 50p for every single journey made. And there's a positive externality to that journey because it was made by bike, obviously from a transport congestion point of view and from a public health point of view. That person is better off, and so it makes sense that journey is slightly subsidized. And then we sort of have a sliding scale. So as I showed you that photo there, cities with a bike, e-bike, and e-scooter shared system, we shouldn't get a subsidy if someone gets on the scooter, but we should if they get on a bike. And then, you can match that subsidy outcome based, as in rides. Everyone is motivated to get people using the thing. And everyone's financially motivated to get people using the thing. And that's it's very, very simple for us to invoice the local authority on that basis, thanks to like the accounting technologies and the GPS technologies that are around. And one thing to take that to its sort of next extreme, one thing that we haven't done yet, I'd really like to do, is also put that in a cargo bike system. It's like, I could imagine a bike, e-bike share system, or a bike, cargo bike, e-bike share system, whatever it is, where maybe it's £1 subsidy for the bike, but it might have to start off as like a £5 per use subsidy for the cargo bike. But that's that's fine, because like the positive externalities of someone using a cargo bike is massive, because you're helping local businesses, going back to Marcel's sort of fundamentals, which by the way was an extremely useful slide for me to see as an operator. Helping build wealth in the community, helping local businesses, getting 3.5-ton vans off the road that are often driving around city centres empty, getting that off the road versus what might be a hybrid Uber. That seems like a really good goal, and it's a tool of industry.
I hate to interrupt you, but I wanted to get Gregoire's thoughts about this as well, in terms, this is the financial viability, and especially, Gregoire, where you're providing a slightly different kind of service than Philip's company. I wanted your perspective on that as well.
Yeah, thank you, Carol. So the key question here is is demand responsive transit actually expensive? And usually our answer is quite simple. It's DRT is not expensive itself. What could be expensive, of course, is public transit in a very low density area. There's practically no mode of transport which will allow you to transport for very cheap price people in a very rural area. So overall, DRT is for us the funding of DRT is very similar to the funding of public transit in general, and it faces the same kind of challenges. And that's why we approach it with a similar approach, a similar spirit, which is to first start by planning DRT. Even though the DRT is something which is controlled by algorithms, it doesn't mean you should not plan and understand what are the dynamics of DRT, and this depends heavily on the context, on which areas you're covering, which use case, what kind of population, what is the typical length of the trip, and depending on that, you could have a DRT which has better financial KPIs than a bus, or maybe a bit more. I mean, it will really depend on the local constraints. So that's what we tell our customers. There are lots of things you can do about the cost of a DRT service. Lots of criteria you can play on to manage if you want a better quality of service or a better price, a higher pooling rate, for instance. So those are things you can plan and play with. Of course, what we do is really to approach this with simulations, to really understand with a real tool how it allows you to have some reliable figures and KPIs regarding the financials of a DRT service. So that's really what we would recommend.
Thank you so much for those insights. And you mentioned another issue that I don't see enough discussion about, which is KPIs. And I think several of you mentioned that in your presentations. Raul, you had talked about that in your presentation, and I was wondering, where are you in the development of that? Our old KPIs don't work. Just simply reporting ridership is not something that tells me anything, and it does not indicate impact on travel behavior or a host of other factors about mobility. So can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, sure. And I'm going to tie this response to the previous question as well. I think asking, is DRT profitable or is the business model viable, is the wrong question. It's really to say, what is the total cost of ownership of mobility, right? When California put its state on lockdown, they were saving something like $4 million a month because of lower traffic deaths, because of lower insurance costs, et cetera, et cetera. So when we talk about those kind of things, it's sort of a false equivalency. What we need to look at is, okay, how much money are we spending, and what is the best mode to deliver that service? In some cases, it may be an Uber or a Lyft that are subsidized. In many cases, like DRT is perfect for a paratransit replacement. The average cost of a paratransit trip in the United States is about $37. Carry one person about 2 miles, right? That's a lot of money, and it's not exactly sustainable. So going back to the question you had about KPIs, this idea of the Transit Effectiveness Index, which is something I'm working on right now. We haven't rolled it out fully, but it is an index that compares a variety of different measurements, some being service quality. So in terms of your core operations and maintenance, your on-time performance, but other ones looking at things like, okay, if there are 2 points, how long will it take a person to travel from one point to the next by car, by transit, by DRT, by autonomous vehicle, by scooter, by bike? And then by saying, okay, which of those modes is the most effective for this, taking into account things like equity and accessibility. Sorry, my tongue's tied today. And then weighting all of those metrics to actually determine how effective your mobility ecosystem is. For me, I was chairman of the board of Maas Global when it was just a fledgling startup. We helped raise money, work closely with Sampo. And we always looked at Maas as just kind of the initial foray. When we talk about things like mobility as a service and technology enabled mode integration, we need to think of it as a policy. And that's when the real metrics come into bear. When we talk about mobility integrators being a city, they can actually measure how effective their different modes will be and then allocate resources accordingly. So I know that's not a cut and dry answer to your question, but it is simply to say that we need to put the hands of mobility regulation in the right places, have technology providers integrate with them, and then have users use the right mode. And as we do that, the data will show what are the proper metrics to measure. We're doing it bottom up right now.
Yeah, I agree with everything you said. And I think it's important that that's the perspective we have moving forward and not relying on all of these other metrics that really don't explain how the services are being utilized or what their impact is for sure. One other topic that came up in a number of the presentations, and I want to just sort of go back to it a little bit. I think Marcel probably mentioned it more, is talking about equity. Whenever we say technology enabled, right away, we're sort of making this grand assumption that everybody's got the technology, when we know that that's not always the case, or we're not offering the service in areas that really need it, but often get overlooked. And so, Marcel, if maybe you can sort of lead us for another minute or two into your thoughts about equity, since you kind of opened the discussion. Thanks.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Carol. I think to take a step back, we very much support piloting and innovation and understanding, right? Like, had we have not just said yes to, dockless mobility in the city of LA, we wouldn't have had the data or the information to even understand the equity issues, right? I think you have to, as a policymaker, be ready to, alter your path. And I think for us, we understood that the dockless program in the first year was not serving low-income populations. And in part is because we surveyed users directly, right? There wasn't a middleman, it was direct, just users. Of the users who responded to the survey, about like 10,000, 90% of the people who responded who used dockless mobility through various providers didn't even know that there was a low income program, right? And so what did we do, right? And the good thing is we didn't have to do a lot because our city council member let us know. Our city council was like, that's, you know, you can't have 5,000 scooters in Venice Beach and not be in Watts. It's unacceptable. And so we had tried to use carrot approaches, and now we're using more stick approaches, right? And so I think it's just, but we also have a part in that as a city, right? Like I want to see dockless mobility succeed. So how can I help? How can I help facilitate the pathway? I think what operators, particularly in a competitive market, want is they want a level playing field. And when some of their competitors are acting disingenuously, then they say, well, what? I'm the good guy. I'm complying, and this other person is just testing the limits because they've done a quick cost-benefit analysis of what it means to break the rules, right? And so, you know, that's, I think, how you adapt, but you have to adapt quickly. And I think you have to try a lot of different things, right? Like, I think one of the things for us, why it's so important, like when we talk about KPIs of our public bike sharing system, we're getting slaughtered in terms of like ridership and metrics. But guess what? I have a safety net of shared mobility that, you know, what worries me, and we tried to do this several years ago around car sharing. We spent like 2 years on an RFP for car sharing that tried to get the equity right and the distribution. And you know what happened? We awarded it and the company never executed on it. And we spent 2 or 3 years. And for all I know, that could have been a strategy. Let's lock car sharing out of the LA market. And so, you know, you have to be quick to adapt, to try different models. I think for me and for the work that we're doing, I'm fortunate enough that, you know, I'm on the executive team. You know, I report directly to our general manager. I used to work for the mayor. I can pick up the phone and call him and call the chief of staff. And so like, not every city can benefit from that, right?
Exactly.
That level of access, that like ability to pick up the phone and talk to a city attorney because one of the companies is going to sue you, right? And so I think that's why we need seasoned people in the public sector to be able to kind of like strike the balance between supporting innovation, but also keeping their public mandate of, you know, providing public benefit. And so
Definitely.
I think there's more models to explore, right? Like, I don't think it's a zero-sum game, right?
No, I agree.
I think for me, you know, I just came off of, I spent 6 weeks head down with a team that included our local community college, LA Trade Tech, the Los Angeles Clean Tech Incubator, a South Los Angeles nonprofit focused on equity, and a couple other players putting together a sustainable transportation equity program. We thought about career ladders, we thought about opportunities, we thought procurement that benefited local hire or business cooperatives. We thought about anti-displacement. We thought about how do we build capacity for residents to sit on the RFP, on the request for development and selection. Yeah. And to build and not just ask them to come and spend their time, but actually fund them to spend time going over an RFP and providing training services for them to build capacity, because they're the ones who know best what's going to work in their community. And so I think it's, and it might not be it might not be public bike share, it might not be micromobility. What it might be is an electric bike lending library, right? That is based out of a nonprofit or a community organization based in that geography who knows what they're going to do it. And for me, that is an ecosystem, right? That is, you know, they could then jump to bike share, or they could then jump to scooters, right? And so I think it's really important, I think, to spend the time, and we don't traditionally do that as a city, to go and figure out like what do stakeholders want and bring them along for the trip, and then support the private sector or the public sector in achieving the goals, but you gotta be measuring it. And I think what was really interesting is that we never really had the ability to measure before the mobility data specification in a really robust way, you know, and there was people who were not reporting, you know, there was people who was gaming the system because they thought we weren't going to do a physical audit, but we did, you know, and
Right.
so, you know, those are things like, but it takes a ton of resources. Now,
Yep.
people might find this shocking, but we generated like over $3 or $4 million in permit fees. Is that acceptable? I mean, that's crazy, but I was able to build MDS. I was able to hire consultants. I was able to hire, you know, and resource it, right? Pay overtime, pay a bunch of staff because people are like, we want this to happen now. And so those are just kind of some of the elements. And, you know, I think that.
Thank you for that.
You're welcome,
Yeah.
Carol. Thanks.
So I think in the interest of time, I hate to say that our discussion has come to a close, but it has. And once again, I want to thank all of the speakers. I want to thank Intelligent Transport for having all of us here. We could continue the discussion for a whole nother day, I'm sure of it. But I want to say thanks to everyone, and thank you to the audience for hanging in there and participating in the polls. So thanks very much. Have a good rest of your day. Bye, everybody.
Thank you, Carol.